Alright, in this video we're going to be taking a look at lab safety rules, safety agreement that you need to complete for grade 9 advanced science before we can jump in and do more complicated experiments in the lab. You have this in your yellow booklets. It's around, I forget which page it's on right now, but it's in the introductory pages of your data booklet, of your laboratory booklets. So it's broken into different sections. The first section, general laboratory rules. We're not going to read every single one of them, but I'll highlight a few of them, and then I want you to read over the ones that we don't look at together here. So the first rule is basically telling us that when we're in the lab, listen to your teacher or listen to the laboratory assistant for instructions. We often give pre-lab instructions, so we'll give details of what you're supposed to do, including safety things, at the beginning of the experiment, and we expect your close attention at that time. The second rule doesn't really apply to us usually because we don't usually ask you to read the experiments before we do them. We'll just go over them when we're in the lab. Rule number 3 has a phrase there, no horseplay will be tolerated in the lab. Basically, the lab is a dangerous place sometimes if you're not careful, so we don't want any kind of fooling around, running around. You're not treating it like you would in a normal classroom. Okay? Do not work alone in the lab. What that means is don't do an experiment if there's nobody else around you. In our experiments in this year's COVID-19 version of the lab, each of you will be working individually, but you'll be working in a room full of other people. If you were by yourself, you wouldn't do an experiment without anybody else around. Rule number 4, make sure you're aware of the safety equipment in the lab. We have safety showers. There are 2 of them near the lab, or 3 of them, I should say. We have eye wash stations. There are 3 of those. There are safety goggles. There are fume hoods. Make sure you know where all of those things are. There's a bin for broken glass. We'll point those out to you when we get to the lab the first time. One of the most important rules, the one that's probably the most important, is rule number 5. When we're dealing with chemicals, we must be wearing safety goggles at all times in the lab. Now, for this year's COVID-19, we have ordered some extra safety goggles, and for grade 9 advanced, we intend to issue a pair of goggles to each student, so you'll have your own goggles that you take with you when you go home. You should probably wash them when you're finished the lab and you get home. Give them a wash with soap and water. If you have some kind of disinfectant spray, you could do that also. We do have goggles that we share in the lab. Those are also disinfected each day, but for grade 9 advanced, we're going to be issuing you your own pair of goggles just as an extra safety precaution. We ask that you wear footwear that covers your feet, so generally no sandals are allowed in the lab. Occasionally we'll let that go, but if you were to drop something and it splashed on your feet, you'd want to have your foot covered with a shoe or something like that so you don't burn yourself. If you have longer hair and we're using Bunsen burners, then we'll ask you to tie the hair back. If we're not using Bunsen burners, longer hair will be fine. Really, really loose clothing would be a problem, so we might ask you to take off a sweater or something and put it in the classroom if it's really, really loose. If you wear a head covering in the lab that hangs down, we'd ask you to tuck that in, or sometimes you could buy a sports version of a head covering which doesn't have a lot of loose clothing around it. No jackets and bags in the lab. That's rule number 6. Keep things clean at your bench. That's a good general rule. If you spill a chemical or have some garbage from the experiment at your station, make sure you clean it up immediately. Don't leave spilled chemical there where somebody else could come in contact with it. There are lab stools in our chem lab, but they're almost always kept under the benches during experiments. We don't want them pulled out where they can become obstructions in the aisles. They're there because sometimes someone might have a broken foot or a broken leg and they've got crutches, so they'll need to sit down. or sometimes people are doing a test in the lab and they use the stools to sit and work on a test. You have sinks at each station. We'll be using matches, often to light Bunsen burners, or you'll be doing things and dropping things in the sink. Be sure you keep the sinks clean when you leave. If you're grabbing chemicals to use in the experiment, make sure you read the labels and be sure you're grabbing the correct chemical. They'll have appropriate WHMIS labels on them that you've read about or seen in your online WHMIS safety course. So be sure you look at the safety precautions, etc., when you read the label as well. A good practice at the end of any experiment is to wash or rinse your hands. We'll be using gloves a lot in our experiments this year, so washing your hands isn't as big of an issue now. But if you haven't been wearing gloves, you'll definitely want to be washing your hands. If you injure yourself, burn yourself, cut yourself, no matter how small, please let your teacher or the laboratory assistant know. We'll be the judge of whether you need any kind of first aid. Don't ever eat or drink in the lab. So not even a bottle of water. Okay, that has to be left in the classroom. Don't chew gum, don't have candies. If you had a really, really sore throat, we might let you have that, cough candy or something, but no food, no drink in the lab. The next section on prevention of fire and explosions. This one's not as common, but there will be labs where we use alcohols, different types of alcohol, and Bunsen burners. Alcohols are highly flammable, so they have to be kept in the fume hood, which will keep their flammable vapors from getting into the lab, and will give you specific instructions for how to handle them safely. Make sure your Bunsen burners are turned off if you're using one and you're not at your station. Don't walk away from a lab station that has a Bunsen burner lit. Okay? If you're heating a test tube or a bottle or something like that with a burner or on a hot plate, make sure it's never capped or stoppered during the heating, because the gas inside will expand and it could blow up. So always have a uncapped or unstoppered test tube or flask when you're heating. The next section on preventing injuries, we've already talked about the need to wear goggles all the time. If you drop a test tube, drop a beaker, something like that, it happens. There'll be broken glassware. Don't pick it up with your bare hands. There's a broom and a dustpan to sweep up broken glass, and there's a bin that you would put that in. Don't put broken glass in the normal garbage can, because that could get to a cut or something for a custodian who's cleaning. Let's keep going here. Skimming down. Let's see. Sometimes we're going to need to smell a chemical in a test tube or a flask or a beaker. You don't just put it to your nose and take a big sniff. You waft it with your hand gently towards your nose and get a small smell of it. We will demonstrate that when we get to that point in the experiment. Okay? All right, let's keep going here. Some of these rules don't really apply for grade 9 science, so I'm skipping over some of them. Rule number 11, if you do spill a chemical on your hands, make sure you will have been told at the beginning of the experiment about safety, but generally you'd want to rinse your hands off thoroughly and with lots and lots of water to get rid of that chemical. If you had a major spill and it got all over your body or something, that's never happened, but if it did, that's where we have the safety shower in the lab to deal with that. All right, we will be heating a test tube with chemicals in it. Keep the test tube pointing away from you when you're heating, and keep it pointing away from your partner, so if anything were to come out of the test tube during the heating, it's not going to come towards you or your partner. Okay, being prepared for emergencies. We talked about this a bit earlier. Make sure you know where the eye wash is, the fire extinguisher, the fire blanket, the safety shower, the basic safety equipment in the lab. If you're wearing your goggles, which you will be, and a chemical splashed on your face during the experiment, Don't take the goggles off. Leave the goggles on. Go to the eye wash station and rinse your face with lots of water before you remove the goggles. If you had chemical on your face and then you removed the goggles, you'd risk getting chemicals in your eye. So be sure that you've rinsed your face with the goggles on. Now, if you were not wearing goggles and you accidentally got chemicals in your eye, you would get to the eye wash station and you're going to be in there for 15 minutes with your eyelids open, flushing your eyes with water for a long time. And you'd be doing that with your teachers or lab assistant supervision. If we deemed it necessary, you would then get further medical attention. We don't recommend that people wear contact lenses in the lab because if a chemical were to get in your eye and it would get under the contact lens, the washing from the eye wash station would be less effective. Having said that, we're not going to require that you not wear contact lenses. If you have to, you have to, but we'd recommend that you wear glasses instead. We talked about spilling a lot of chemical. You'd use the safety shower to rinse yourselves off. If you hear the fire alarm go off during an experiment, we're going to leave the lab like we would leave the classroom. But if it goes off and you're using a Bunsen burner, then the first thing you would do would be to turn off the gas at your station before leaving the lab. So you'd turn off the gas, turn off the burner, then you would leave the lab. Don't worry about ruining your experiment. If it's a fire alarm, a fire drill, we need to get out of the building. Okay? Why don't we leave it there? Those are the major rules for lab safety. You're going to need to fill out this portion of the lab safety agreement. So do you wear contact lenses? If so, will you be using them? You'll put your name in this spot here, attesting to that you've read over the rules. You're going to sign the sheet. You'll sign or put the date down. You'll put your teacher's name, either Patnode or Watts. You can indicate which period you have. You'll get your parent or guardian to sign also and put the date down. And then take a picture of this portion of the lab handout and you'll submit it on Google Classroom as a PDF document. All right, so those are lab safety rules. We're going to be in the lab on Friday this week for a very simple activity. We'll be in there again next week for another a little bit more complicated one. So in the first 2 weeks, we won't be doing anything very dangerous. But after that, we'll be doing some experiments with a bit more skill, a bit more involved, and these safety rules will be important to keep in mind.